In Will to Power 818, we find a passage among Nietzsche's unpublished notes entitled On the Order of Rank. This passage would become of great importance to the French philosopher Georges Bataille, who quotes it in part in his book On Nietzsche. But before we talk about Bataille, we're going to look at the entire passage from Will to Power. Nietzsche writes, quote, "What is it that constitutes the mediocrity of the typical man? That he does not understand that things necessarily have their other side, that he combats evil conditions as if they could be dispensed with, that he will not take the one with the other, that he would fain obliterate and erase the specific character of a thing, of a circumstance, of an age, and of a person, by calling only a portion of their qualities good, and suppressing the remainder. The desirability of the mediocre is that which we combat. Their ideal is something which shall no longer contain anything harmful, evil, dangerous, questionable, and destructive. We recognize the reverse of this, that with every growth of man, his other side must grow as well, that the highest man, if such a concept be allowed, would be that man who would represent the antagonistic character of existence most strikingly, and would be its glory and its only justification. Ordinary men may only represent a small corner and nook of this natural character. They perish the moment the multifariousness of the elements composing them and the tension between their antagonistic traits increases. But this is the prerequisite for greatness in man. That man should become better and at the same time more evil is my formula for this inevitable fact. The majority of people are only piecemeal and fragmentary examples of man. Only when all these creatures are jumbled together does one whole man arise. Whole ages and whole peoples, in this sense, have a fragmentary character about them. It may perhaps be part of the economy of human development that man should develop himself only piecemeal. But for this reason, one should not forget that the only important consideration is the rise of the synthetic man, that inferior men, and by far the great majority of people, are but rehearsals and exercises, out of which here and there a whole man may arise, a man who is a human milestone, and who indicates how far mankind has advanced up to a certain point." End quote. This unpublished note articulates what could be called a principle of Nietzsche's thought, the sense that the qualities we name quote, good, and those we name, quote, evil, are not mutually exclusive qualities, but perhaps, as he says in Beyond Good and Evil, insidiously knotted together, crocheted together, grown up together. We might imagine two intertwining shoots from the same stem. These good and evil qualities require one another, but not merely because it is only sensible to talk about one if we have the other as a point of contrast. But on a more profound level, Nietzsche would argue that they sustain one another, even provoke one another to higher growths, and indeed, on the most fundamental level, they are of the same essence, good and evil. We also find this principle operating in the early pages of The Gay Science, in which Nietzsche muses on the great benefit of evil and destructive characters to the advancement of mankind. The tension created by the collective's warfare with these ambitious and criminal or aberrant individuals is in fact beneficial, and a lack of conflict in this regard would be stultifying. And so, as Nietzsche points out here, the mediocre person of the community, they want safety, they want to eliminate everything that contains this antagonistic character, anything that's evil, dangerous, questionable, destructive, and yet those qualities are precisely the things that benefit the community through this productive tension. But even in developments in morality that Nietzsche himself believes to be harmful to the human race, such as the otherworldly values of Christianity and the ressentiment that drives the slave morality, these save the story of humanity from becoming too fatuous, too trivial. Even sickness gives us a meaning because it is something to struggle against. We might think of the final pages of Beyond Good and Evil, in which Nietzsche's genius of the heart, Dionysus, declares his intentions to make mankind stronger, more beautiful, and also more evil, just as he suggests in that passage in The Will to Power. But there is another passage earlier in Beyond Good and Evil that I'd like to bring in this context, which also seems to have be working off of the material in this note. And that's the conclusion to chapter 2 of the text, The Free Spirit. And this is section number 44 from Beyond Good and Evil. Quote, "We opposite ones, however, who have opened our eye and conscience to the question how and where the plant man has hitherto grown most vigorously, believe that this has always taken place under the opposite conditions. That for this end, the dangerousness of his situation had to be increased enormously. His inventive faculty and dissembling power, his, quote, spirit had to develop into subtlety and daring under long oppression and compulsion. And his will to life had to be increased to the unconditioned will to power. We believe that severity, violence, slavery, danger in the street and in the heart, secrecy, stoicism, tempter's art, and devilry of every kind, that everything wicked, terrible, tyrannical, predatory, and serpentine in man serves as well for the elevation of the human species as its opposite." End quote. So, when Nietzsche speaks, therefore, of the whole human being in that passage in Will to Power, he describes this human being as one who carries within the antagonistic or oppositional character of existence. Mankind up to this point has been a fragmentary project. It has developed piecemeal, it has developed in parts. Whole ages and nations and civilizations can be described as fragmentary because the plenitude of qualities that can be exhibited by the human race is so multifarious, contains so much possibility for self-contradiction and self-antagonism, sometimes mounting to the level of self-destruction, that every reigning morality must select from among these various oppositional virtues and emphasize one at the expense of its opposite. And as a result, we have the suppression of certain traits and qualities which are circumscribed by the community, and other traits which are sanctioned by it. That's the mediocrity enforced by the communal moralities under which man lives. That's the leveling effect of those moralities. Mankind is fragmented in a certain fashion in accord with the needs of collectivities, and that fragmentation, in a sense, is the very establishment of the meaning of good and evil within the tablet of values of a people. These terms are given content by this fracturing of the individual. According to this interpretation of human life on the part of the community, mankind's qualities partake of these mutually exclusive essences of good and evil. So then, who is this person that Nietzsche calls the opposite man in Beyond Good and Evil, or we opposite ones? It can only be one who contains this opposition, who realizes that it is under these conditions of opposition that man flourishes. And so, too, the type of person that Nietzsche describes in Will to Power is the whole human being, a human being who is not fragmented in the way we've described. He would therefore care little for what the mediocrity of man finds to be desirable. He would care little for the moral ideals, which ultimately are the source of this fracturing. The reason, perhaps, why mankind has only been able to advance piecemeal is precisely because the mediocre person can't survive without being fragmented. His inner opposition would destroy him, would rend him asunder. That's the suggestion here. And so he can't brook the possibility that his good is, in some sense, of one essence with his evil. His virtues are part and parcel with his vices, and vice versa. Parts of his psyche, his background, his inner life, the whole physiological play of forces within his body, these parts are judged, suppressed, and confined. And so it would require a new kind of strength, perhaps, to endure such an inner tension and to affirm one's good qualities as interrelated with one's evil qualities, judging neither at the expense of the other. So for Nietzsche, the entire point is for humanity to attain to this degree of wholeness. Every so-called great individual up to this point has been at most a signpost on the road, and we've yet to reach a milestone, because the totally intact human being, the human being who is better and more evil all at once, represents a sort of totality that for us remains a potential and not yet an actuality. It is still on the horizon. This totality, this entirety that Nietzsche sketches out in his notes, Bataille interprets as a state of total freedom. Quote, "The essence of entirety is freedom," end quote. What attracts Bataille to the work of Nietzsche is, among other things, the notion that he finds within Nietzsche of a positive conception of freedom, within this idea of the whole human being. He says that we cannot attain this freedom by struggling for it, for in becoming a fighter for freedom, one engages in a negative struggle for freedom against external oppression. In doing so, one alienates himself and becomes fractured yet again. Because, as we will see, any commitment to a particular way of life or a particular course of action, really, a particular goal for life, becomes a fragmentation. As soon as we fix a certain ideal onto life and say that is the goal, we have fractured the species. Quote, "It's the positive practice of freedom, not the negative struggle against a particular oppression, that has lifted me above a mutilated existence," end quote. The desire for a solution to this problem of the fragmented human race, and the desire for a way of life that takes a step closer to the whole human being, is what Bataille says motivated these writings on Nietzsche, written during World War II in France. It has become popular these days to attribute the salvaging of Nietzsche from ill repute after the war to Walter Kaufmann and his existentialist and individualist reading of Nietzsche, what many would call the artist's Nietzsche. But this framing is incorrect because Bataille was reading Nietzsche as an opponent of fascism before the war even began. Nevertheless, Bataille is a different animal from Kaufmann. He would have been the last person to deny the centrality of war and violence in Nietzsche's work. And for the record, I don't think that Kaufmann does so either, but that's at least the common uncharitable interpretation of Kaufmann, which we can set that aside. In fact, Bataille was fascinated by the warlike aspect of Nietzsche, even as he disdained the Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche's love of war. Because of this, Walter Benjamin remarked that Bataille embraced a kind of pre-fascist aesthetic. Frankly, Bataille has always had a much harder edge than many on the left are comfortable with, but Bataille was in no way interested in presenting his ideas in ways that would be comfortable with mass opinion. Sylvain L'Étranger writes in his introduction to the text, quote, "Reclaiming Nietzsche from the Nazis was also a way of validating his own fascination for violence and fanaticism, a, quote, fundamental aspiration of humanity," he said, that the fascists misappropriated. In the spring of 1939, while everyone was praying for peace, Bataille could be found hailing the war as, quote, something ordinary life lacked, something that causes fear and prompts horror and anguish, like falling off a rooftop or a volcano erupting, end quote. When the war broke out, Bataille was in his early 40s, and he had recently suffered from tuberculosis. For much of France, all there was to do during this period was to wait, really. Life sort of ground to a halt. But Bataille's health was such that he did not even really have the realistic option to go pick up a firearm and actively resist. He went on leave from his job as a librarian and spent much of the war in the French countryside, alternating between Paris and smaller towns outside of Paris. But from the years 1941 through 1945, Bataille experienced one of the most productive periods of his career. He wrote Madame Edwarda, and then the 3 books that he later planned to compile into a work called Summa Atheologica, a play on the title of Aquinas' opus. But whereas Thomas Aquinas provides a summary of theology, Bataille would have considered this trilogy as a summary of atheology, an atheistic theology. This triptych consists of guilty inner experience and On Nietzsche. Today, we're just talking about the material in On Nietzsche. Bataille would later say that Nietzsche was his main companion in these years, and as we will see, Bataille nevertheless has great disagreements with Nietzsche. He struggles with Nietzsche. He points out Nietzsche's failures where he sees them. He diverges from Nietzsche wildly in terms of both his desires and also in the sense of discarding many of Nietzsche's concepts or taking Nietzsche's concepts and making them his own. But Nietzsche is his companion, his friend during these hard years, and from Bataille's perspective, boring years. Bataille was born in 1897, so he's one of the last children of the 19th century. His childhood saw the twilight of what is called the long 19th century, the years leading up to World War I. In his youth, he became a devout Catholic for a time. Although at age 23, Bataille discovered Nietzsche, and that changed everything for him. He came to reject the Christian religion, though he nevertheless remained fascinated with the mystical side of Christianity. He was mentored by Lev Shestov, an anti-metaphysical philosopher who had criticized the deification of reason that he felt had characterized the philosophical project of the Enlightenment. In that respect, he is as much of a philosophical descendant of Kierkegaard as he is of Nietzsche, the common thread being the attack on this undue faith in the laws of logic to which we've now come to think that even God has to conform. So Shestov's existentialism can be interpreted as of perhaps the religious variety, but he would become a key influence on many of the 20th century French philosophers because of his unsystematic approach. His opposition to systems is probably also influenced by Nietzsche. Georges Bataille is a very important philosophical node in the history of the 20th century. He's a living connection between ideas and figures. He's part of the surrealist movement early on, though such a movement would prove rather difficult to hold together. And Bataille split off from surrealism. Or, another way of interpreting that, as Stuart Kendall told me when I spoke with him recently, is that he practices a different kind of surrealism, which is very much opposed to the surrealism of, for example, André Breton. And Bataille would later attempt to found something far more radical, the secret society Acephale. Because of the secret nature of Acephale, we can't know all of the details, but the members were said to meet in the middle of the night in the woods near where this tree had been struck by lightning. And the most infamous rumor concerning Acephale was that the members planned to sacrifice one of their numbers. And all of the members volunteered to be the sacrifice, but no one volunteered to be the executioner, and so the sacrifice never took place. The symbol of Acephale was drawn by André Masson. It's a headless Vitruvian man, again conjuring the imagery of sacrifice, but further, the group celebrated the decapitation of Louis XVI because the sacrifice of this ruler by beheading, like cutting off the head of France, creates the conditions under which the masses become headless. There was also a publication that bore the name Acephale, which would become influential in the history of 20th century philosophy, but in a subterranean way, which I suppose is apropos. It doesn't take the world by storm when it's first being issued, but now this is, we might say, a cult following for Acephale. One of Bataille's goals with this publication was to usurp Marx and replace him with a new legislator, Nietzsche. Along with Masson, Pierre Klosowski, who we talked about earlier this season, was also involved with Bataille's Acephale project. And just overall, Bataille's radical break with the traditional grounding of left politics, which is born out of surrealism and these unorthodox methods of writing and of reading, frankly, of interpreting, that would greatly influence the most significant figures in postmodern thinking or post-structuralist thinking, including Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, and many others. Bataille spent basically all of World War II writing. His diaries from 1944 even provide a record of the last days of the war, the arrival of the Americans, and the retreat of the Nazis. So, in addition to everything else we've talked about, he's also a rather interesting primary source for a major historical event. Having survived the war years, Bataille always regarded them, in retrospect, as tedious. He even came to see the excessive destruction of World War II as an outcome to be avoided in the future, if possible, in spite of his perhaps early enthusiasm for war. War is an object of meditation, as Kindle puts it. After the war, some of his most important and influential works were published, such as The Accursed Share and Eroticism. He died in 1962 at the age of 65. Bataille calls on Nietzsche a chaotic book, and he says it couldn't have been any other way than that. After Bataille's preface, just to give you a sense of the structure of the work, so we have the preface, sort of an attempt at presenting the work in a way that will make it hold together, so to speak. The next section is called Mr. Nietzsche, which contains probably more quotes than commentary. Actually, I would say definitely more quotes than commentary. It seems to be an attempt to produce a sketch of Nietzsche as Bataille sees him. This is followed by the section entitled Summit and Decline, which is perhaps the most traditionally philosophical portion of the work. It's the place in the work where I felt most comfortable. And it has within it a record of a lecture that Bataille gave to Jean-Paul Sartre, Hippolyte, some other notable figures, entitled A Discussion on Sin. And this is followed by Bataille's diaries from the year 1944, and these contain all sorts of things, day-to-day anecdotes, personal accounts. Sometimes almost feels like it's approaching autofiction. They also contain philosophical musings, poetry, and delirious ramblings. And finally, there are some appendices on assorted topics which seem to have been included with the purposes of clarifying some of the concepts used in the above sections, but they don't always do the best job of providing clarity. I will admit that I was somewhat blindsided by the content of On Nietzsche. Bataille is not known for writing according to usual stylistic guidelines, but this book is particularly chaotic because it's part lecture, part autobiography, part poetry, part prose, part interpretation of Nietzsche, and other parts just, there are some sections that consist of nothing more than a kind of collage of quotations and excerpts. And at other times, it isn't clear that he's talking about Nietzsche whatsoever. In other words, this is a fragmented work, ironically enough. Bataille makes no pretenses of himself being the total human being. He is, like all of us, fragmented. The entirety is perhaps something we experience at certain summits of existence, which is a concept that we will get to in a moment. But and I also really much liked the way that Stuart Kindle put it, that in a way perhaps he's accelerating the fragmentation, producing the most fragmentary work possible to bring each fragment to its limits. And the idea of, in many ways, Bataille is a philosopher of limits and what it means to go to the limit or to exceed the limit. And that will become important in our analysis as well. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the first three sections of the work, but mainly the preface and summit and decline. In the following episode and the conclusion to this season, we're going to discuss Bataille's journals from the year 1944, which make up the majority of On Nietzsche. In his preface to On Nietzsche, Bataille takes Nietzsche's assertions on fragmentation and the whole human being that we talked about at the beginning. He arguably takes some of these ideas even farther than Nietzsche does. Bataille suggests that all action is a source of fragmentation. And that may seem like Bataille is exalting a sedentary kind of existence or something along those lines. But when Bataille says action in this context, the word has a certain sense to it, a certain connotation that I think will become clear in the following excerpt. Quote, "But what does fragmentation mean? Or better, what causes it, if not a need to act, that specializes us and limits us to the horizon of a particular activity? If it turns out to be for the general interest, which normally isn't true, the activity that subordinates each of our aspects to a specific result suppresses our being as an entirety. Whoever acts substitutes a particular end for what he or she is as a total being. In the least specialized cases, it is the glory of the state or the triumph of a party. Every action specializes insofar as it is limited as action. A plant doesn't usually act and isn't specialized. It's specialized when gobbling up flies. I cannot exist entirely except when somehow I go beyond the stage of action. Otherwise, I'm a soldier, a professional, a man of learning, not a, quote, total human being. The fragmentary state of humanity is basically the same as the choice of an object. When you limit your desires to possessing political power, for instance, you act and know what you have to do. The possibility of failure isn't important, and right from the start, you insert your existence advantageously into time. Each of your moments becomes useful. With each moment, the possibility is given to you to advance to some chosen goal, and your time becomes a march toward that goal, what's normally called living, end quote. And I think it's no accident that Bataille also uses the metaphor of a plant here, given that Nietzsche talked about the species mankind as a kind of plant in Beyond Good and Evil. But notice the way that Bataille is discussing action in this passage. He's talking about action from the lens of instrumentalization, from the perspective of putting things to use, or indeed putting ourselves to use. Action in this context signifies that which we do as a means to an end, which many would say, well, aren't all actions taken for that reason? Whenever we take some object or some moral aim or some ideal social condition or even our own personal desire for advancement in some domain of activity or another and make that an end, we make ourselves, or indeed our lives, into means. And what do our lives consist of other than time? And so we take the only thing we really have, which is time, and spend that time, expend that time and energy to advance towards some goal. And in doing so, we necessarily cut off other possibilities for what we could be, for what we could spend our lives doing, other purposes for which we could put our lives to use. Kierkegaard has that wonderful quote, marry and you'll regret it, don't marry and you'll regret it. Whatever you choose to do, go to the party or don't, go after your dream job or don't, live a life of quiet desperation or don't. You'll regret it either way. Bataille might say in his own language, you'll be fractured either way. However you choose to act, whichever qualities within yourself you choose to emphasize, whichever personal or collective tablet of values you choose to observe, whatever morality or goals guide your life, that life will be fragmented, unless, of course, there is a possibility for another way of being entirely. So perhaps we could look to what it would mean to set a milestone for human life. What were the lives that seemed to approach the entirety, the totality of their possibility? What would it mean to look to advance along this path towards the totality rather than towards the aims of moral goals or provincial values and petty desires, religious forms of devotion? And this is what inspires Bataille about Nietzsche. He sees in Nietzsche's counter-movement against the mediocritization and the instrumentalization of mankind. Against that, there's this articulation of the problem of reaching the whole human being, which had probably not even really been posed as a problem before that. Now, of course, that might lead us to another kind of paradox, right? Because is not the whole human being another goal? Does it not become another goal, another object towards which we take action and therefore have to subordinate ourselves and our lives to? Perhaps that would just be using language as a rope to tie ourselves up with, right? That is a common Zen Buddhist sort of saying, tying oneself up without rope. And Zen Buddhism is actually referenced more than once here in On Nietzsche. There's even one of the appendices about it. And so that might seem like a cop-out, but the first thing I would say is that when you really grasp what we're getting at here, I think it is kind of a false problem. But Bataille struggles throughout On Nietzsche with his attempt to say the unsayable, to write philosophically about non-knowledge, to articulate a description of a summit that you can't attempt to reach, and to do all this, to speak about all this in a manner which is not, unintelligible, right? Which actually seems to intimate something, which actually seems to suggest something beyond our ordinary fragmentation. And the analogy to Zen Buddhism, just to spend a little bit more time on that, because I think it could be instructive. When the realization of Buddha nature is the quote unquote goal of Zen, right? But whenever it's articulated as a goal, whenever you instrumentalize yourself to this as a goal and you pursue it with ardor and, with all your actions become subordinated to that purpose, where you're spending all this time and effort putting your body to use, maybe you're sitting zazen in order to attain Buddha nature. The Zen masters all say you're perverting the real teachings of Zen. They often emphasize the spontaneity of the realization experience because of this, and argued against the idea that one can become enlightened by practice, that it can't be that I've spent 20 years sitting here meditating and studying sutras, I should have gotten enlightened by now. That can't be articulated as the point of Zen or the way to carry out your practice. And so we could provisionally describe it as a kind of mystical experience, which is what Bataille will call a kind of summit, but it can't be reached by trying to reach it. So Bataille describes his own kind of summit on Nietzsche, and he describes it from the very beginning as something that can't be attained by, quote, putting oneself to use. An idea from Bataille's broader work that becomes relevant here is the concept of expenditure. In all these actions taken in service of an end, we expend time, we expend energy, effort, with the expectation that we're going to get a return on our investment, right? In financial terms, we expend with the goal of acquiring something, of accumulating. And our lives are therefore spent in service of accumulation. But is there another kind of expenditure in which nothing is expected back? Is there a type of expenditure or a mindset in which we can expend frivolously, luxuriously, uselessly, we might even say foolishly? These are terms in which Sloterdijk also, he describes the overflowing type of generosity expressed within Nietzsche's work. He calls it unbilled expenditure. He describes Nietzsche's work as a declaration of the innocence of expenditure, of the kind of expenditure with sufficient spontaneity to escape from the clutches of avarice and its calculations. Bataille, of course, was also a great critic of utilitarian views of life, this calculating approach to life, which he sees as sort of part and parcel with bourgeois society and mindset. And thus he describes his search for the freedom of the entire human being in these terms, quote, "The practice of freedom lies within evil, not beyond it, while the struggle for freedom is a struggle to conquer a good. To the extent that life is entire within me, I can't distribute it or let it serve the interests of a good belonging to someone else, to God or myself. I can't acquire anything at all. I can only give and give unstintingly, without the gift ever having as its object anyone's interest," end quote. So, shocking claim at the beginning. The practice of freedom lies within evil because the totality of a human being or an age or a people or a moment in time always contains evil. The totality always contains it. Bataille describes his own exuberance in this search as a desire to burn with desire. That's how he elaborates on it later. So in other words, a kind of desire that justifies itself, which has itself as its own ends, which means it can never ultimately be in service of anything, because this type of desire would only lead back to itself in a type of circular fashion. And it's also, even though the comparison to Zen Buddhism is apropos, this is a great difference from Bataille and the Buddhists in that it's like the central quandary of Buddhism is sort of, how do I desire not to desire? Whereas Bataille is saying, how can my desire be aimed solely at desire? Bataille also describes this entirety of life that he seeks in other terms, quote, "Entirety is also longing for laughter, longing for pleasure, holiness or death. Entirety lacks further tasks to fulfill," end quote. So laughter, pleasure, holiness, and death, these are all sort of they're they're very different, right? Concepts that he's just brought there, but he's not bringing them forward as goals. I think what he's saying, although this is certainly open to interpretation, laughter justifies itself. Pleasure, in some sense, justifies itself. Holiness is sort of, it's held above the world. The sacred is held above the profane. Death, in some ways, is it's like an incomprehensible, it's a zero. It's something that we can't quite wrap our minds around, the, non-existence. So all of these things that aren't really, they're not goals of accumulation. They're all things that justify themselves or are completely incalculable. They can't be brought into the logic with which we normally make our evaluations of the worth of things. I mean, we could say crassly that the holy is often held as a kind of religious goal and death is avoided as the ultimate evil or something like this. But this is, I think what we're drawing out here is that these are sort of limits, right? That what is holy can't ever be justified. The search for the holy can't ever be justified by a list of accumulation of personal benefits from following the holy path in life or something like this. And here, Bataille doesn't speak of death as something to avoid, but as something to be longed for. That's, again, sort of the transition between existence and non-existence. That's totally incomprehensible, and yet is the destiny of every living being. So it is possible to perceive this totality now, or again, as I said, to get a suggestion or an intimation of this totality, whereas it was not before, in part because the world is increasingly specialized, and each of us increasingly specialized to a particular task or focus. We are more fractured than ever, and that's true. We can see that in academia. It's true in many professional fields, frankly. You could argue that it's part of the inherent logic of the market, which has become recently technologically accelerated to this great degree, but it imposes this narrowness on our being that produces an even stronger desire to see what it is that transcends the narrow world delimited by particular goals and activities with the aim of getting a return. And what it means to contemplate this can be rather difficult to express, because it's like trying to embrace the sum total of all potential meanings of human life that have ever been put forward, while at the same time refusing all of them and viewing mankind strictly through the lens of its total potential rather than its active manifestations, all of which are fractures. I think the closest that Bataille comes to attempting this description, even as he admits that all of his attempts will be ultimately failures, is in the following passage. Quote, "If I want to realize totality in my consciousness, I have to relate myself to an immense, ludicrous, and painful convulsion of all humanity. This impulse moves toward all meanings. It's true, sensible action proceeding towards some single meaning, goes beyond such incoherence, but that is exactly what gives humanity in my time, as well as in the past, its fragmentary aspect. If for a single moment I forget that meaning, will I see Shakespeare's tragical, ridiculous sum total of eccentricities, his lies, pain, and laughter. The awareness of an immanent totality becomes clear to me, but as laceration. Existence as entirety remains beyond any one meaning, and it is the conscious presence of humanness in the world, inasmuch as this is non-meaning, having nothing to do other than be what it is, no longer able to go beyond itself or give itself some kind of meaning through action." End quote. Laceration is one of Bataille's favorite phrases, which I think it can be understood through the metaphor itself. He's describing a kind of experience in which we might say that the continuity of the body, its limits, are broken or maybe violated in some way. As limited things, we experience what is limitless, what is beyond all limits, as experientially akin to an encounter with nothingness. And he says in one of his appendices that nothingness is a limit of an individual existence. Beyond the limits that are set by the necessities of our being, there is only an absence, a void. And a laceration invites us to glimpse what is beyond our limits. A laceration exposes us. It discloses what's beneath the surface of the skin. And so this experience of the entire human convulsion a conception that transcends our particular being, delivers us over to a state of yearning for something that can't be grounded in action, nor given a meaning communicable in language. Bataille makes the rather strong claim that anyone who hasn't experienced what he calls the dazzling dissolution affected by this sense for the totality will be unable to understand Nietzsche's work. Without this central experience of a dissolution, and it's presented here as a kind of mystical experience, Nietzsche's work becomes a maze of contradictions, he says. It is a dissolution because we have already placed before ourselves a conception that defies conceptualization. We've already set a goal which can't be a goal. What we have is a possibility of a concept more than a concept itself, which seems to place us beyond philosophy. It's a perception of a potential, perception that to realize this potential would place us beyond all ordinary conceptions of knowledge and the self. And thus this potential stands beyond the limits of what can ordinarily be talked about or even thought about. And one of the ways in which Nietzsche, in which the interpretations of Nietzsche go astray for Bataille, is in the attempt to take Nietzsche's ideas and re-present them as doctrines, which is to say as ends or as ideals, as goals which motivate action. When Nietzsche's philosophy is interpreted as something that outlines the goal or the object of our lives in the form of a principle that we have to submit to, we take Nietzsche's philosophy of freedom and make it slavish. And this is what makes systems of Nietzscheanism, in whatever form they appear, somewhat farcical. After all, you would be following a man who said he would rather be a clown than a saint. Is it any wonder that the ideologies of his followers would be giant farces? And I want to read again from the preface here in abridged form, where I think Bataille gets this across very well. Quote, "The will to power, considered as an end, is regressive. Taking such a course would return me to slavish fragmentation. I'd assign myself another duty, and the good that chooses power would control me. The divine exuberance and light-heartedness expressed in Zarathustra's laughter and dancing would be reabsorbed, and instead of happiness at the brink of the abyss, I'd be tied to weightiness. The destiny Nietzsche gave humankind places him beyond laceration, hence the profound non-viability of this doctrine. In the notes compiled in The Will to Power, proposals for activity and the temptation to work out a goal or politics end up as a maze. His last completed work, Ecce Homo, affirms absence of goals, as well as the author's complete lack of a plan. Considered from the standpoint of action, Nietzsche's work amounts to failure, one of the most indefensible, and his life amounts to nothing, like the life of anyone who tries to put these writings into practice." End quote. Now, we have to ask, is Bataille really saying that Nietzsche's life amounts to nothing? I mean, I've already mentioned Nietzsche was his companion, even as he's critical of him, so perhaps this isn't terribly surprising that he might seem to be criticizing Nietzsche in this way, but we have to keep in mind the way he phrases this. From the standpoint of action, his work amounts to failure, which we can see from the preceding sections has nothing to do with Bataille's goals, we might say. Even to invoke that Bataille's goal is a lack of a goal, we can see how we get into paradoxes talking about this. But whenever will to power is transmuted into an end, that is to say, when it is interpreted such that one says, the purpose of life is to seek power, we're simply substituting one old Christian conception of the good for a new conception of the good that privileges power now as a guide for action instead of, say, pity or compassion. Bataille is one of the first interpreters to oppose the fascist readings of Nietzsche, and he does so on this basis. It's another attempt to harvest doctrines from Nietzsche. And in my opinion, in many cases, they don't even really get these ideas from Nietzsche. They already believe certain things, and then they go in and selectively extract ideas that conform with what they already believe. But it's part of this attempt to contain mankind within a moral schema and continue the regime of fragmentation just in a new form. And Bataille points out, I think correctly, that Nietzsche's political writings are contradictory on several points. They also change in ways that are both subtle and dramatic. And it seems as though Nietzsche can never make up his mind whether or not it is even worthwhile to articulate a philosophy of action, as we might call it, in this context. Nietzsche knows from his, quote, impulsive theories of cognition and consciousness that philosophical ideas can be appropriated by impulses in the play of forces. They can bring those forces into awareness, but they don't steer the course of these forces. And the result is that those who extract a politics from Nietzsche have to ignore these contradictions, smooth them over in some way, arbitrate the dispute according to their own sentiments. And as Bataille points out, if we look to Nietzsche's final word on his writings in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche says something rather funny in that work that Bataille, he quotes later in the text about how he's never put in a single ounce of effort toward a goal. Quote, "I can't recall efforts. There's no trace of struggle in my life, and I'm the opposite of heroic natures. My experience knows nothing at all about what it means to, quote, will a thing or work at it ambitiously or relate it to some goal or realization of desire," end quote. Which is a very funny thing for Nietzsche to say, isn't it? But I know exactly what he's talking about. I don't hold making music as some goal that I have to subordinate my will to in an aesthetical fashion and exert effort towards. Sometimes effort is involved, but there's a kind of pleasurable effort when you begin to work at something that you get this enjoyment out of just the act itself. Same thing for writing, same thing for, frankly, doing this podcast, right? So it's interesting that Nietzsche says that in Ecce Homo. He says, I'm the philosopher of will to power. I have no idea what it means to will a thing and work at it ambitiously. Very different from the common interpretations of Nietzsche, isn't it? But Ecce Homo is also where Nietzsche denies his future followers. He says he has no intention of founding a religion. It's where he says, I'd rather be a clown than a saint. It's where he reasserts that he is an immoralist, and he reiterates that Zarathustra, as the first true psychologist, is a friend to the evil man. Again, we got to keep these ideas of fragmentation and entirety or totality or wholeness in our mind as we move through this text. And as Bataille reminds us in a later section, quote, "In the end, the only knowledge Zarathustra's students gain is to repudiate their master. For it is said to them that they should hate him and, quote, raise their hand against his crown. For the follower, the danger isn't the prophet's admonition to, quote, live dangerously, but not having, quote, something to do in this world," end quote. In what we've considered so far, I think one could rather clearly see the influence that flows from Bataille to Klosowski and then to Deleuze and Foucault and so on. And Bataille emphasizes a Nietzsche of freedom, of play, and above all, chance. On Nietzsche is subtitled The Will to Chance. Bataille quotes from the lines in Zarathustra about throwing dice, which would later fascinate Deleuze very much, and he presents any sort of prescriptive or normative aim in Nietzsche's work as incoherent from the perspective of his immoralism, as Klosowski will also assert. And here I don't mean as a simple contradiction of different conclusions Nietzsche draws at different times. I mean that the deep logic of his immoralism and his semiology of the impulses, it's really incompatible with any kind of moral agenda. As is the vicious circle of the eternal return, as Klosowski will very much focus on. And this is both the strength and the weakness of the French Nietzscheans, in my view. On the one hand, they really take Nietzsche's anti-metaphysics and anti-moralism seriously. They look to Nietzsche for weapons because of his perspectivism and because of the power he gives us to disassemble apparently rational certainties beneath valuations, showing us instead that the valuation is behind reason, not the other way around. If I were to put it into Bataille's language yet again, we can say Nietzsche lacerates the skin of our logic and shows us the musculature, the bloody meat underneath, which is valuations, which is life, which is all of this organic sort of messy stuff, right? But on the other hand, sometimes this orientation can almost produce something like a consistent habit of looking away from Nietzsche's reactionary sentiments, perhaps becoming too comfortable to let the text disappear under the weight of interpretations, because after all, that's all there is. Although even, again, that attitude could be Nietzschean, but what is it even to say an attitude is Nietzschean if the texts can be interpreted in any way that we want to? Again, we can set aside these paradoxes. What I find interesting about Bataille, though, is that he's attempting to describe something that transcends morality. It transcends moral goals, and yet this something, this experience with totality, this intimation of it, that shows us a possibility for a human life that's not fragmented, that is itself the basis of all moralities in Bataille's analysis in a very interesting way. The uniting thread is sacrifice. Whether we sacrifice to the gods or for the sake of some proximal moral end, it makes no difference. Quote, nothing radically changes when instead of human satisfaction, we think of the satisfaction of some heavenly being. By saying God and acting on his behalf, we reduce him to ordinary ends that exist in action. If he were situated beyond, there would be nothing to be done on his behalf. End quote. So Bataille, strangely enough, echoing a sentiment of Benjamin Franklin there, if I'm not mistaken, that if God were infinitely above all human concerns, he wouldn't desire any such sacrifices or placation of his will that to be carried out by human beings. That's all sort of a nonsensical concept. But so we're going to get into, I think, what's one of the more complicated ideas on Nietzsche, particularly in Summit and Decline, in talking about this idea of how the summit is related to morality. The summit that Bataille has his eye on is occasionally reached in service of morality. But he says that moral ends are distinct from the excesses that occur in their pursuit. So moral aims can provoke, we might say, a movement that can bring one to the summit as perhaps an unintended effect. If there is a conception of the good here moving in Bataille's thought, it is a good that is necessarily devoid of a morality constructed around it, and it is a good that is in a real sense synonymous with evil. He writes, quote, an extreme, unconditional human yearning was expressed for the first time by Nietzsche independently of moral goals or of serving God. Nietzsche can't really define it, but it motivates him, and it's what he unreservedly makes his own. Of course, ardor that doesn't address a dramatically articulated moral obligation is a paradox. In this context, there is no preaching or action that is possible. The result from this is something disturbing. If we stop looking at states of ardor as simply preliminary to other and subsequent conditions grasped as beneficial, the state I propose seems a pure play of lightning, merely an empty consummation, lacking any relation to material benefits, such as power or the growth of the state, or of God, or a church, or a party. This consummation can't even be comprehended. It appears that the positive value of loss can only be given as gain. End quote. Further down he continues, quote, to be done with obligation and good. To expose the lying emptiness of morality, he destroyed the effective value of language. End quote. And that last point, this has been a focus of mine recently in approaching philosophy, the connection between naming and value judgments, and thus the way in which philosophy is a linguistic exercise in giving names, using names in new ways, in order to manifest new judgments about life, perhaps we might say even in a rhetorical form, that where the strength of one's power of persuasion determines how effective he can be in using language to elevate new valuations. But Nietzsche, according to Bataille, is so effective in vivisecting philosophy and in disclosing the inner workings of how valuations are assigned by these legislators. He so thoroughly exposes those workings that language's power to inspire action by making new valuations is destroyed in Nietzsche's work as a consequence of that work. And so Nietzsche's philosophy, in the final analysis, is a pure play of lightning, as he calls it. It can't be justified. It can't be sanctified by becoming manifest in actions. His philosophy cannot impose obligations or duties. It can't inspire us to sacrifice, nor can it tell us what our sacrifices shall be for what purpose we ought to lacerate ourselves, to destroy what we hold dear as part of this sort of apparently wasteful sacrifice unless we moralize it into some kind of transaction with the gods or something like this. And we talked about this when during the analysis of Pierre Klosowski's Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, this doesn't mean that Nietzsche doesn't try to fix a meaning on life, that he doesn't attempt to produce goals in the vulgar sense of the term, some sort of moral meaning to life. It seems to me that what Bataille is saying here is, again, his vivisection is so powerful that all of that becomes sort of impossible. It makes that style of activity, whenever it comes through in Nietzsche's work, as a kind of a farce yet again. What is articulated here, though, is a longing, a yearning for the limitless. And the way that Bataille describes evil in one section of the work is as, quote, the opposite of a constraint, end quote. So we haven't fully fleshed it out yet, not by a long shot. We're still getting there, but this union of good and evil, right? The liberation is often, that's how the spiritual quest is presented. The goal is liberation. This is true in Buddhism as well as in Christianity. And yet, in this sense, evil becomes identical with the temptation towards total liberation, which for Bataille, that can only really happen. It can only be realized if we attain the summit of humanity, the wholeness of the human being. And a bit later in the text, this is how Bataille defines summit and decline. The summit is this limitless experience. We could even describe it through terms of an evil violation of limits, which nevertheless reveals something, which is nevertheless a kind of revelation. And the decline is part of the exhaustion that follows, in which the excesses of the summit are then harnessed for the sake of inspiring action, but the yearning for its limitlessness, the limitlessness of the summit, becomes blocked by moral constraints. Quote, rather than being a reply to ardent desires for the summit, morality is more likely a barrier opposing them. Exhaustion quickly results, and inordinate expenses of energy to which the desire to break down being's limit compels us no longer encourage the preservation of our being, that is, our good. End quote. So morality is a barrier erected against this yearning for the summit, provoked in some sense by the summit experience. Found, for example, in sensuality, in crime, out of the recognition that these expenditures, these excesses, are going to wear us out and destroy us. So perhaps that's the true yearning, this kind of the Freudian death drive, right? That's what's beneath all these sort of destructive, excessive desires. Perhaps that too is a way to the summit experience. Morality represents exhaustion because it's a barrier we throw up to this by a people, which or like some sort of community or collective or any kind of way of life that feels that these excesses can't be afforded any longer. And here we're talking about morality in the sense of the moral rule, moral constraints that take the preservation of our being as their goal. The rule compels, the rule restricts. It tries to basically shape and push and direct action in accord with the goals. And with the descent into action, very interesting way of thinking about it, the descent into struggle on behalf of parties and states or these conceptions of the good, that's where fragmentation enters the picture. And there's a really interesting passage that Bataille cites from Will to Power, and I'm going to read the translation that appears in my version of Bataille's on Nietzsche, followed by his commentary. So Nietzsche writes, quote, "We'll make philosophy a dangerous thing, change the idea of it. Teach a philosophy that is dangerous to life. What better service can be rendered to philosophy? The more expensive the idea, the more it will be cherished. If we unhesitatingly sacrifice ourselves to notions of God, country, and freedom, and if all of history is the smoke surrounding this kind of sacrifice, how can we show the primacy of the concept of philosophy over popular concepts like God, country, and freedom, except by making the former more expensive than the latter, showing that it demands still greater hecatombs?" End quote. And Bataille writes, quote, "If it were ever entertained, this proposal might prove interesting. With no one in the offing waiting to die for it, however, Nietzsche's doctrine is null and void." End quote. When we think back to the aspirations of the Acephale cult to sacrifice one of their members as a consummation, we can begin to see the mad logic behind that plan. the sacrifice of a human life for the sake of a philosophical secret society. Wouldn't that sanctify their movement by offering it the same level of commitment that religious believers offered in ages past to their gods? That commitment took the form of sacrificial victims dying at the altar, or it took the form of a knight willing to throw away his life out of a conviction about the will of God and the glory of sacrifice for Christendom, or even in modern times, a soldier who dies for his country. The point for Nietzsche is that God, country, or even these abstract ideas such as freedom, they show themselves to be valuable because they're expensive, because we expend for them. It's the expense that's invested in these things that reveals them as valuable, even when they're complete phantasms, as Nietzsche would say about the Christian God, or the vulgar concept of freedom that most people have in mind. And so by making greater and greater expenditures in the name of philosophy, maybe we could give it a sense of awe or grandeur. And yet, as Bataille says, no one's been ready to die for Nietzsche's philosophy, which arguably perhaps true, but I guess we'll see how things pan out in the future. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far is really, it has made up the background, what I would describe as the background of the profound and radical interpretation of Christianity that Bataille advances in Summit and Decline. It's one of its most shocking, but also its most interesting aspects. It's through Nietzsche's immoralism and his vicious attacks on Christian morals that Bataille comes to this understanding, and we'll see in his analysis all of the familiar themes that we would associate with Bataille come through here: guilt, laceration, sacrifice, violation of limits, and so on. And Bataille draws out these themes through Nietzsche, through Nietzsche's fixation with the deep meaning of the Christian narrative, the myth, the story it tells us about reality on the most fundamental moral level. Christianity, according to Nietzsche, tells us a story in which the perfect man, the just man, God incarnate, is tortured to death. And that, in itself, is a revelation about the character of the world in which we live. The Christian judgment about the world is that this is the kind of existence in which we should expect the justest man to meet the worst kind of death. Nietzsche makes that point in Daybreak. And so the deepest values of Christianity, from Nietzsche's perspective, are pity, compassion, suffering with, that motivates action, that comes out of the pain caused by beholding or experiencing the suffering of others in some way, and guilt is sort of the other side of that coin, the poisoning of the consciousness by giving us a conscience that inflicts a morality that punishes the strong or punishes the cruel, punishes us animals, us normally cruel and animals who wish to discharge our strength in some way, punishes us for being what we are. Most strangely, Christianity is a morality theoretically aimed at the relief of suffering, but it has this paradoxical relationship to suffering insofar as the suffering of God on the cross is a holy thing. It's something from which Christians can take inspiration when they are suffering. Suffering brings us closer to Christ. And so we can imagine that at one time, the sort of deification of suffering could be a very helpful coping mechanism. But eventually the idea proliferates that suffering is good for the soul, and it's a penance for the sin that crucified Christ. The promise of a future relief of suffering becomes deferred to the afterworld. So even though Christianity is a religion about relief from suffering, it's always deferred to a future time, and then meanwhile, all sorts of self-mortification practices emerge in the Middle Ages among the more penitent members of the Catholic Church, and so on and so forth. All these stories glorifying martyrdom and the tortures of the martyrs. So, this becomes a very unhealthy series of thought patterns. But nevertheless, we might notice something in this story it's not quite explicit in Nietzsche's analysis, but Bataille arrives at this by contemplating the symbol of the crucified God with all of the devotion of Nietzsche. In the Christian story, God's suffering is both the source of our collective guilt as a species, or the guilt of the whole human race. It is also God's plan that Christ should be condemned to suffer in this way as a sacrifice on behalf of the human race, which as a consequence allows man and God to come into communion with one another. So it is because of the grace of God, the pity of God, who so loved the world, that he ordains that such a sacrifice must occur. But in the thing that God ordains, in the sacrifice, the human race commits a crime, the worst crime possible, and becomes perpetually guilty. And so to put this in vulgar terms, but terms which I think will bring out the analysis that Bataille is making here, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is an act of good and an act of evil. Remember what Nietzsche has told us of the interwovenness of good and evil. And that's exactly what Bataille sees in this sacrifice. It's a supreme act of evil that was required for achieving the good, the communion between God and man. Quote, "The killing of Jesus Christ is held by Christians as a group to be evil. It is the greatest sin ever committed. It even possesses an unlimited nature. Criminals are not the only actors in this drama, since the fault devolves on all humans. Insofar as someone does evil, every one of us being required to do evil, that person puts Christ on the cross. Pilate's executioners crucified Jesus, though the God they nailed to the cross was put to death as a sacrifice. Crime is the agent of this sacrifice, a crime that sinners since Adam have infinitely committed. The loathsomeness concealed in human life, everything tainted and impossible earned in its secret places, with its evil condensed in its stench, has so successfully violated good that nothing close to it can be imagined. The killing of Christ injures the being of God. It looks as if creatures couldn't communicate with their Creator except through a wound that lacerates integrity. The wound is intended and desired by God. The humans who did this are not less guilty. On the other hand, and this is not the least strange, the guilt is a wound lacerating the integrity of every guilty being. In this way, God, wounded by human guilt, and human beings, wounded by their own guilt with respect to God, find, if painfully, a unity that seems to be their purpose. If human beings had kept their own integrity and hadn't sinned, God on the one hand and human beings on the other would have persevered in their respective isolation, a night of death wherein creator and creatures bled together and lacerated each other, and on all sides were challenged at the extreme limits of shame. That is what was required for their communion. Thus, quote, communication, without which nothing exists for us, is guaranteed by crime, end quote. So the concept I brought up earlier that we've been building to, perhaps some of you found it a bit hard to believe, right, or a bit of a stretch maybe. Insofar as Bataille was positing sacrifice as the center of all morality, describing the longing for some kind of laceration that tears at our limits, reveals the limitlessness of the absolute to us. Well, here in Christianity, the most influential religion in Western thought, we must conclude that Bataille's description fits rather well. We achieve communion with God by the evil act of lacerating God, both by physically torturing and killing him, but also by violating the moral limits that God has placed on mankind, by sinning. And it is the worst sin, the sin that exceeds all limits, that makes redemption possible. And thus communion, or as Bataille says in scare quotes, communication. And communication here is pointing to some sort of basis which is perhaps more fundamental than mere speech, which might be better described through religious terms such as communion, the bridging of subjectivities. So true communication between man and God. We're talking about something on that level, a bridging, a coming together. Bataille continues, quote, "In the elevation upon a cross, humankind attains a summit of evil. But it's exactly from having attained it that humanity ceases being separate from God. So clearly the, quote, communication of human beings is guaranteed by evil. Without evil, human existence would turn in upon itself. A fundamental principle is expressed as follows. Communication cannot proceed from one full and intact individual to another. It requires individuals whose separate existence in themselves is risked, placed at the limit of death and nothingness. The moral summit is the moment of risk-taking. It is a being suspended in the beyond of oneself, at the limit of nothingness." End quote. perhaps to be offensively Jungian, I think Bataille is describing something almost archetypal here. He's gesturing towards this fundamental aspect of human existence that is so vast, in a sense, it's almost hard to comprehend the scope of what he's talking about. We almost need an image or a narrative, and trying to put it into abstract terms almost will always fail. But by conceiving the summit of morality, we perceive the meaning of morality even in its most mundane and banal forms. Part and parcel with morality is the necessity of sacrifice, of risking one's individual existence, risking lacerating oneself, destroying oneself. Communication in this sense is related to morality in that morality is what makes communication possible, and probably vice versa, right? Again, we can refer back to the aspect of valuation and naming and the practical reality that a shared set of values, just as a shared set of signs, of signifiers, is that which binds together. And this sacrifice at the center of moralities is it's evil. As Bataille says a few sections later, quote, individuals or humans can only communicate, live, outside of themselves. And being under the necessity to communicate, they're compelled to will evil and defilement, which by risking the being within them renders them mutually penetrable each to the other, end quote. And there are many potential double entendres in Bataille's work. There's certainly an intended sexual double entendre here. Bataille in the preceding sections digresses into his perspectives on the relation between this will for nothingness and sexual desire and temptation. Sex is on Bataille's mind throughout these writings, especially in the diaries. And given this, his comments are strangely similar, once again, to teachings you can find in the Pali Canon, for example. Teachings which are aimed at moderating or suppressing sexual impulses, strangely enough. Passages in which the body is described as essentially a bag of filth, right? The Buddhist is supposed to remember whenever he has a sexual urge, the disgusting reality of the organs concealed beneath the skin, the excretions that come from the orifices. Those orifices are really the true object of your desires. And so how disgusting is this? The point is that disgust can be a check against temptation, and it's a technique, therefore, to remember that about the human body. Now, keep in mind, those passages were directed at audiences of monks, not the lay people. These are people who took a vow of chastity, so they might need mental techniques to fend off desire and keep to their oaths. Of course, the same could be said of Christianity. Perhaps the comparison to Christian asceticism is more appropriate in this context, but I'm not as familiar with, there's a few lines from St. Paul about best not to marry or copulate at all, but if you have to, best to get married, then rather to do that than burn with desire. I'm familiar with some of the anti-sexual things in Christianity, but just not as much as I am with the Buddhist scriptures. Anyway, digression there. And so Bataille muses, we see the beauty of a naked body by focusing on its outward appearance and the formal sense of purity. We have to overcome a sense of obscenity or disgust, he says. It's a zone of nothingness that we have to cross. It's not as if we're risking literal death, but rather becoming ruined and fallen in our own judgment. So that's the sense in which it's a laceration. It's not a laceration in the sense that risks death, but if we violate the sexual morals of society by, for example, hiring a prostitute, that sense of shame, we're sort of like threatening our identity by carrying off that shame with us. So, quote, crude obscenity gnaws at my existence, its excremental nature rubbing off on me, this nothingness carried by filth, this nothingness I should have expelled, this nothingness I should have distanced myself from, end quote. There's so much in this book, and there's so much to Bataille's views on sexuality and death and nothingness, for example, in eroticism. So I'm not going to be kind of covering the whole gamut of everything he says in this book. That would be impossible. But what we should notice here is the fact that when we defile ourselves, when we do something evil, in this case, in the case of sexuality, it's in the name of communion and in the name of communication. We sacrifice the purity of our individual limits in exchange for an excessive experience with the limitless. And so we might think of the little death, that nickname that the French have for the orgasm. So it's not a literal death in sexuality, and it takes on there is a sacrifice, but of a more abstract or idealized form. But let's try to bring this back to the broader implications. In both cases, you have this sacrifice. And again, historically, this traces back to the actual sacrifice of lives and resources for the glory of gods and spirits. And it would seem that this is, in some sense, can be interpreted as a life-promoting practice of mankind. And I can't help but think of Girard in this respect. He would have agreed that sacrifice was the grease on the wheels of civilization, but he also regarded sacrifice as an act of evil, the sacrifice of Christ as the ultimate evil. But he felt that the death of Jesus on the cross was the short-circuiting of this, what he calls the scapegoating process that drives sacrifice. And with Christ's death on the cross, it allows mankind to finally sympathize with the innocent victim. In other words, Girard embraces some of these same contradictions while still more than willing to condemn evil and uphold the Christian age of guilt as a good thing, as a good development. And it is interesting to compare that attitude to that of Bataille. For example, in this passage, quote, "In such a light, evil appears as a life source. By destroying the integrity of existence in myself and in others, I open myself to communion. I attain a moral summit. And the summit isn't a submission to, but a willing of evil. It is a voluntary pact with sin, crime, and evil, a pact made with a relentless fate that requires that while some live, others die," end quote. Now, just a section later, Bataille will call the connection between evil and life a fictional relationship. This is because he has presented communication as the good of being in some sense, and therefore fallen into incoherence by making communication part of the very thing that it exceeds. Our being is necessarily particular, limited, and communion is this thing that opens up our being to interpenetration. The problem, once again, is positing a course of action as a good and therefore defining a goal that the summit facilitates. The summit becomes a means to an end, but that returns us to slavish fragmentation. So we're back to the same paradox, right? Familiar to all the mystics, structurally the same as the problem of seeking Buddha nature in the context of Zen, and that's where we run up against the limits of language. And so this is why we have to acknowledge that the relationship Bataille is presenting here is fictional. But let us now recall what Bataille said at the very beginning of these writings, that Nietzsche was the first to put forward this unconditional human yearning, the yearning for the limitless, without justifying it by reference to moral goals or serving God. And remember that whether the sacrifice is for the sake of God or for the sake of man, it makes no difference to Bataille. In both cases, the sacrifice is being interpreted as if it is put to some use. Whether there actually is a god or gods that can be appeased by the sacrifice would be another matter. It shall suffice to say that the sacrificers imagine that there is such a being, and therefore they're operating according to the same logic. This point in our analysis probably requires at least a cursory discussion of the concept of the accursed share, or the notion of expenditure. So the accursed share is the portion of resources, goods, whatever the society values and seeks to acquire and produce and accumulate. This is the portion that's excessive and therefore superfluous. And the reason why this surplus is regarded as accursed is because it seems that every system, every social arrangement is doomed to have this surplus, and thus to have some share of what it reaps spent unproductively. And these systems, these collectivities, they want to spend everything productively. They always want a return according to pretty much every moral logic. We want our actions and our sacrifices to be for something. And this becomes interesting when we consider what Bataille writes in the notion of expenditure, insofar as, again, especially bourgeois logic, which he regards as sort of utilitarian logic, basically calculation of the good in terms of quantity, the primacy of production and productivity, can't tolerate non-productive expenditure without a return, unbilled expenditure. And so it's incredibly common to come up with a framing of useless expenditure which attempts to put the loss back into that logic of utility. So, for example, jewelry, fine clothing, all of these useless luxuries become a form of social capital. The waste of one's wealth becomes a measure of their social standing, because the more that you can afford to waste, the more respectable you are, the greater your fortune is. And this comes out in the example of potlatch, the competitive forms of giving in which one attempts to humiliate even their competitors through the giving of gifts. And the most extravagant gift elevates its giver above the recipient. But I do want to stress that this doesn't just apply to bourgeois logic. If we follow the arguments given in, say, Dialectic of Enlightenment, we can perceive in even pre-Enlightenment myths prefigurations of this tendency to rationally dominate the natural world and attempt to extract value from it. In Odysseus's dealings with the gods, he tries to cheat them. The sacrifice is a transactional religious enterprise, one that can even involve guile and deception. And yet again, nothing changes when we shift the recipient of the sacrifice from man to God. It's still an attempt to interpret the loss into something productive. And so this surplus, this share, becomes at once sacred and accursed in a way, because non-productive expenditure is the bane of all calculations from utility, and so we always seek to transmute it into something productive, insofar as we think in moral terms. Bataille outlines this as a principle later in On Nietzsche, quote, "Because all risk, assent, and sacrifice, like sensual excess, is loss of strength or expenditure, we have to motivate expenditures each time with promises of advantage, whether illusory or not," end quote. So what I'm trying to get across here is that superfluous expenditure has always existed. And Bataille doesn't think we could ever live in such a way in which there's no useless expenditure, nor would I say that he would think that we should live in such a way, that we should avoid useless expenditure. If anything, he's pointing to that as really, like, again, the desire that desires itself. Our expenditure done luxuriously, uselessly, foolishly even. And so what would it mean then to, like, what if we were to try and define that type of expenditure, an expenditure truly independent of all moral goals? What would that mean? And he introduces this notion as a kind of gambit. It's something he's willing to risk. Remember, again, the subtitle of the work, The Will to Chance. Bataille writes, quote, "I open up the prospect of infinitely upping the ante. Within that retreating prospect can be glimpsed a summit, as the highest point or the most intense degree of life's attraction to itself that life can define, as a kind of solar explosion independent of consequences," end quote. So unbilled expenditure, unproductive spending, when this is done without some moral fiction to reinterpret it as productive, this is in itself life's attraction to itself. That's what it is revealed to be. And can that be increased until we reach the utmost limit of living purely out of attraction to life? And Bataille goes on to identify evil, quote unquote, with morality, quote unquote, in an even more fundamental sense. And I use these scare quotes because these terms don't really make sense unless we comprehend them in the specific sense that they've been elucidated thus far. But this is what he writes, and I think it's incredibly fascinating. Quote, "The very notions of good or being interpose a duration and concern that essentially are unknown to evil or summit. What is substantially rejected in evil is a concern with the time to come. It's precisely in this sense, that longing for summit, that our impulses toward evil constitute all morality within us. Morality in itself has no value, in the strong sense, except as it leads to going beyond being and rejecting concerns for a time to come," end quote. So take no thought for the morrow, one of the sayings of Jesus that tends to be ignored, or I would say interpreted away by modern-day Christians, especially as those who see Christianity as this pro-social mechanism, and therefore they take the maintenance of society as their main moral goal, because if people really took no thought for the morrow, trusting God to feed and clothe them, well, frankly, they wouldn't be productive. In other words, this moral teaching has to disappear beneath interpretations, because If not for the fact that Jesus said it, it expresses what Bataille here is identifying as the essence of evil. And so the really interesting kernel here is the reversal, so to speak. This is going to be very difficult for me to get across without trying to say what can't be said, attempting to bound the boundless, vulgarizing in some places. But let us recall what Bataille said earlier. Moral ends are distinct from the excesses that they occasion. We have tended to view the excesses as useful insofar as they can be made productive. Thus, the summit of sacrifice is valorized, but only because it facilitates morality. Quote, as long as the excessive impulses to which desire leads can be linked to useful actions, or considered to be such, useful that is for individuals in decline who are reduced to the necessity of accumulating strength, there was a way to fulfill the desire for a summit. Thus people of other times made sacrifices, even indulged in orgies, while attributing to sacrifice and orgy an efficacy of action that would act to benefit the clan or the state. End quote. But now let us suppose we can reverse our view on morality. We say that morality is valuable, if not quote-unquote useful, because we can't use the same language here, but morality is valuable not because of its ends, but because of its excesses. The summit experiences that possess us out of this yearning for a going beyond, that are part and parcel with violating constraints, with crime, right? And so we normally conceive of morality as that which sets limits on human life and action, and accordingly we are called to sacrifice or to self-lacerate as a means to that end. Bataille is saying the true value of morality is that it occasionally leads us to sacrifice and self-lacerate, which is actually an expression of desire for the limitless, which means a desire to violate limits, violate constraint, which means evil. All of our moral system building, all of our tablets of values, are like the exhausted after effects of these evil excesses. They're the barriers we throw up, as we've said, a limit that we establish so that we don't die from lacerating ourselves, right? Which Bataille believes is a kind of fundamental longing for human beings. And so the accursed share and its non-productive expenditures are retroactively justified and sanctified as having been useful for something, and we orient ourselves toward facilitating that usefulness, and thus perhaps reaccumulating our strength after the discharge, perhaps for another chance at the summit in the future. And that's the whole story of summit and decline. The heart of morality is the summit, which is evil, the abolition of all limits. Moral rules, then, are a reassertion of the limits, which then manifests in action, and that is decline. Quote, I can't deny the inevitability of decline. The summit itself indicates it. If the summit isn't death, the necessity of descent follows thereafter. Essentially, the summit is where life is pushed to an impossible limit. I reach it in the faint way that I do only by recklessly expending my strength. I won't again possess a strength to waste unless through work I can gain back the strength lost. I'd never dream of doing away with moral rules, since they spring from inevitable decline. We are always declining, and ruinous desire returns again only as strength is restored, because powerless in us requires recognition, and because we don't have unlimited strength. Why not acknowledge such a necessity, giving into it even as we deny it? End quote. To return to the analysis of Christ's sacrifice, Bataille discloses a relation between Dionysus and the crucified, and that the sacrifice of Christ is described with the language of the summit, and thus in terms of Dionysian ecstasy. This experience of ecstasy is just as essential to the Christian mystics as it is for the Dionysian revelers, who feasted, drank, entered states of frenzy, indulged in orgies, something Bataille says that we still yearn for today. Because the Dionysian self-dissolution, it's a manifestation of this desire for nothingness, in kind of a positive sense, though, right? And the wish to violate all limits, go beyond all limitations in our being. And I think much of the proposed yearning for nothingness, which is one way of talking about this idea in Bataille, can be helpfully interpreted through the Dionysian, as Nietzsche describes it, all the way back in Birth of Tragedy, as a ritual sacrifice of the principium individuationis. Bataille says explicitly that the content of Christian mysticism can be compared to all sorts of non-Christian mystical states. He mentions not only the Dionysian orgies, but the dark night of the soul described by Eastern mystics, such as the Brahmin yogis or Buddhist monks. The translation I have renders it as the long night of anguish, which is perhaps more appropriate to Bataille. But he writes, quote, "Whatever the religious tradition from which mystical trance is derived, it exhausts itself by exceeding being. Taken at a fever pitch, the fire within relentlessly consumes whatever gives people and things their stable appearance, whatever gives them confidence, whatever acts as a support. Little by little, desire lifts the mystic to such utter ruin and expenditure that the life of that person becomes more or less a solar brightness." End quote. Bataille's opinion of these traditions, of course, is that they ultimately affirm the moral barriers to realization, right? The moral barriers to liberation from all limits. All actual violations of moral rules, all vice and licentiousness, these traditions still call evil. The religious practitioner is still a symptom of decline because his summit has become simply a mental representation. Quote, "Since there remains the desire for a summit with which these acts are connected, and since beings are still under the necessity of communicating with their beyond, symbols or fictions have replaced reality. The sacrifice of the Mass, as representing the reality of the death of Jesus, is simply a symbol of the infinite renewal of the Church. Meditational subjects have taken the place of real orgies, drunkenness, and flesh and blood, the latter becoming objects of disapproval." End quote. So, actual violation of limits through sexuality, through actual flesh and blood sacrifice, that's what we're talking about here. The summit is not to be regarded as some abstract thing. It's an actual experience. It's an actual physiological experience, physical experience. And in some ways, the moralization, the reification of these moral interpretations of our excesses is what turns them into abstracted forms. As Nietzsche often pointed out, the preservation of a herd is the repeated character of morality whenever it manifests as a rule of life. Duration, the maintenance of an established good that benefits the populace in some way, becomes taken as a standard. And yet, in light of this standard, sometimes we engage in incredibly wasteful practices. And so with Bataille's idea of expenditure in mind, consider the following passage. Quote, "To the extent human beings take it on themselves to give others a rule of life, they must make an appeal to merit, propose the good of beings as an end that finds accomplishment in the time to come. If my life is threatened for some comprehensible good, for instance, for the nation or a useful cause, my behavior is deserving and is popularly considered moral. And for the same reasons, I'll kill and wreak havoc in conformity to moral law. In another area, squandering resources through gambling and drinking is wrong, though it's right to improve the fate of the poor." End quote. So, something to notice that should be obvious. I mean, war is one of the modern ways that we spend non-productively. And so here war is alluded to as an extremely expensive activity. We describe war often in terms of the expense, actually, speaking of the blood and treasure that must be sacrificed for a military victory. And this expenditure is blessed as a necessity. And whatever is called immoral usually describes wasteful expenditure, which does not support the end of preserving the herd. And so moral rules often involve the regulation of how we use the accursed share. It's not good to squander your wealth on gambling and drinking, but it would be universally lauded as good if you gave that same sum of money to help fund a soup kitchen or something. So in some sense, this is the entire task of morality, to regulate the excess. Everything else is automatically managed by human necessity, right? It's certainly true. Some people will drink to excess at the expense of their basic needs. But those people are generally the exception to the rule. Most people's excesses will be checked automatically if they have no surplus resources to spend. And so morality becomes needed whenever they do accumulate excess, whenever they do accumulate a surplus. And so consider then what Bataille has to say about why we regulate sexuality. Quote, Sexual life, considered in relation to these ends, is almost entirely excess, a savage eruption towards an inaccessible summit, exuberance as essential opposition to concerns for the time to come. The nothingness of obscenity can't be subjected to anything. The fact that it's not a cancellation of existence but only a notion, and one resulting from contact, far from alleviates but actually increases the disapproval generally felt. It is unrelated to value. It is not as if the erotic summit is something heroic attained at the cost of harsh sufferings. Clearly, the results bear no relation to the efforts. Only chance seems to be in charge here. War's tragical aspects, in contrast with the laughable indecencies of lovemaking, have the effect of raising the tone of morality, which extols war and economic profits to the detriment of any sensual life." End quote. As we talked about at the beginning, war and violence are fundamental human aspirations, as Bataille sees it. But he sees very clearly there are ways of sanctifying war and violence, while simultaneously casting shame onto another such fundamental aspiration, which is sensuality. And there are two main reasons that he outlines here. For one, the disapproval stems from the fact that ends of sexual desire are excessive. It does nothing for the moral aims of the social system at large. And we're not speaking here of reproduction. I mean, reproduction is related to sex, but it's not the same thing. And it's precisely the non-reproductive forms of sex that traditional societies judge most harshly. And also, it's worth thinking for a moment about the word reproduction, producing more human beings. So, sexuality is fine when its excesses serve the ends of productivity. Whenever its excesses do not do this, whenever we engage in sexuality simply for itself, there is disapproval. Now, we might say that there's a less purchase of this kind of traditional sexual morality today. Certainly many Christians would still, fundamentalist Christians, there are many who still hold sodomy and non-reproductive sexuality to be sinful. But it isn't clear to me that sexuality is similarly circumscribed by modern sexual attitudes as much as it was in Bataille's time. Although there is something to be said about how sexuality has become a commodity in the modern world. It's been given a monetary value, and it's now being exchanged, as an online good or service. So this excess is being justified by the modern world by giving it a utilitarian logic, which could be very interesting to analyze, but discussing all of this would take us too far afield. The other main reason why sexuality meets with disapproval is because sexual pairings are always up to chance. And we might say this is true on a very basic physiological level, both in terms of attractiveness and whether one chances upon a willing partner whom they find attractive and who also finds them attractive. And so you can attempt to move yourself up a few rungs on the 1 out of 10 scale by looks maxing or whatever the kids are doing these days. Or you could, as we say, let yourself go, be a slob, become less attractive than you could be, drop a few points. But there's this baseline which is determined by a bunch of factors you don't control. There's your genetics, there's your society's conception of beauty, there's your social circumstances, whether you're afforded the luxury of beautifying yourself, how much discipline you have in your personality type. That's always underestimated. People say it's a matter of willpower, but we might say whether you're the type of person who has it in you to beautify yourself is, in a sense, up to chance. And then all the randomness of human life and whether you chance on the right partner at the right time in which the circumstances allow you to pair off. And so chance becomes very important to Bataille in these writings because chance is the way that we refer to whatever is outside of that calculable world of productivity and rational domination. And we're going to talk about the will to chance much more next week when we talk about the war diaries. But just so we have a sense, at least on a surface level, for why chance is so important to Bataille, he says in one of those journals, quote, "To want chance is amor fati, love of fate. Amor fati signifies wanting chance, signifies differing from what was. To attain the unknown and risk it, to gamble it. For a single entity, to risk stakes is to risk losing or winning. For a totality, it means exceeding the given or going beyond." End quote. So for Bataille, the love of fate, one of the most important concepts in Nietzsche, means to want chance. Chance relates us to the unknowable, to whatever is outside what our rationality has already calculated and determined, what has already been evaluated and judged and limited and regulated according to its potential uses. But fortune is fickle. The wheel of fortune is the best-known metaphor for how the future can hold turnings of chance that can bring success or ruin, or even one after the other. And Nietzsche didn't seek for certainty in morality or in metaphysics. In fact, he laughed at our apparent certainties. We must always remember his celebration of experimentation and possibility, and the fact that he rests his hopes in the future. And what is the future? It's necessarily uncertain. And this is precisely what Nietzsche is willing to gamble on, to stake his bets on. While Nietzsche certainly made some prescient predictions, his philosophy is far from articulating certainties about the future. The very fact that he presents two potential opposite movements in the form of the overman and the last man attests to this. It can go in either direction. Nietzsche's tragic outlook on life leads him to the conviction that the best human beings are often botched or ruined in some way. So much for the total human being, then. But what is the counter-proposition, the counter-movement? Can we even imagine this state of excess for the sake of excess? Ecstasy in expenditure with no return, convulsing with the entirety of human potential, no longer fractured by aims and limits, totally liberated and sovereign. Bataille asks, quote, "What then will we do with the excess energies that fall to our lot?" End quote. Of course, this can never be articulated. Just as Bataille earlier described his narrative about the summit's connection to morality as fictional, elsewhere he says, quote, "It appears that the summit's link between a mystical state and impoverished existence, with fear and greed expressed as values of decline, is in a sense superficial and very likely to be deeply fallacious. This doesn't make it any less what is the case. Solitary ascetics pursue an end whose means is ecstasy, and ascetics work for their salvation like merchants buying and selling with profit in mind, or like workers sweating for their wages. If workers or merchants had wealth for the asking, without worries about a future, without fearing death or destruction, they'd leave their workplace or business without further ado and seek out whatever dangerous pleasures presented themselves." End quote. So if the monk had no need for salvation, nothing to work for, the ascetic practice would become valueless. He'd abandon it. Just like a man who was independently wealthy, won the lottery, would quit his job, pursue whatever desires he wishes according to his own yearnings. Is that what this summit amounts to then, the liberation of desire? Well, yes, but importantly also no, because this still remains within the articulation of a moral formula. Formerly, we said the goal is to regulate society. Now we say the goal is the liberation of desire. And it's not an idle consideration, therefore, that leads Bataille to the conclusion that to speak of such things at all is absurd. In fact, the explanation that Bataille has given us is itself evidence of a decline according to its own formula, and he is aware of this. Quote, "Having said goodbye to worries about the future with a blasphemous oath, I lose all reason for existing. In fact, all reason, period. I lose the possibility of speaking, especially speaking as I am now of summit morality as something utterly ridiculous. Out of what reason and to what end, going beyond the summit itself, would I want to explain such a morality? And to begin with, how to structure the explanation? To me, to structure and explain the summit morality assumes the decline, since it assumes accepting moral rules relating to fear. Frankly put, the summit, when suggested as an end, is not the summit, since I'm reducing it to the search for advantage when speaking of it. To construe utter dissipation as the moral summit is to completely change its nature. Specifically, in such dissipation, I'm thus depriving myself of the power of reaching the summit. The only possible way for dissipation to reach the summit is not by intending it. The ultimate moment of the senses requires real innocence, an absence of moral pretensions, and as a result, even a feeling of evil." End quote. As we've already touched upon, the kind of sovereignty that Bataille describes is usually considered as a moral good, as freedom. But here he insists the innocence of becoming, as Nietzsche would have put it, is not an affirmation that you can make without partaking in evil, without rendering evil innocent. To render evil as innocent is itself evil. This is just one of the many paradoxes that have arisen over the course of this meditation in which language fails us. Quote, "To speak of the summit is to put ourselves in a position of instability. We only discover it by speaking of something else." End quote. And so the entire exercise can only ever be an exercise in decline, to speak in these explicit philosophical terms about these things. And certainly Nietzsche would have agreed with that. I mean, the impulse to give reasons and explanations, to put forward a structure, it's a very theoretical and thoroughly un-Dionysian approach to life. Put into terms in which philosophy is normally reckoned with, the summit appears as absurdity, and considered from the height of the summit, philosophy is unnecessary. To become a philosopher is another fragmentation. And so Bataille concludes with the observation, almost a kind of joke, that speaking as he has, he's speaking from decline. His action of speaking is the same as the sick man reclining on his bed and dying. But then he says, quote, "This doesn't mean that I'm not calling for the doctor. I have to apologize for the excess irony," end quote. And in the end, Bataille sort of throws his hands into the air. He admits he has no solutions for these paradoxes that he's raised. He has no answers for many of the questions that may come up. Instead, he claims the right to laugh at the human condition as he has outlined it. Every question will ultimately and finally remain unanswered. The search for truth is yet another one of those ever-receding goals, and when we finally reach the limit of our being and the nothingness of death, all of our pursuits of the truth end in silence. The only answer for Bataille is to laugh. Quote, "When questioning fails, we laugh," end quote. And he then quotes from the Gay Science, quote, and again the human species claimed, we definitely don't have the right to just laugh at anything. And the most prescient philosophers added, not just laughter and joyful prudence, but tragedy and sublime folly too are among the means and necessities of preserving the species. This is consistent. It follows," end quote. Laughter as well as tragedy and folly, beneficial for preserving the species. Now, of course, that puts us back into the language of preservation, of moral rules, of standards for action. But Bataille doesn't exclude himself, again, from the fragmented mankind that produces these. One of the ways in which Bataille understands himself is as a philosopher who is willing to fail, to take the swing and miss. It's part of the gambler's approach to life. You have to be unashamed of your failures if you are to gamble and risk everything. They say you play your best poker when you have the most on the line. You have to be able to love the potential fate of having turned out a failure. Bataille also quotes from Ecce Homo later in the diaries, quote, "Failure should be honored because it is failure," end quote. And so even if these mental remedies end up becoming just one more way of preserving ourselves, one more way of fragmenting ourselves, perhaps laughter and sublime folly are as good as any other inducements to life that have been created. I want to conclude the episode by reading through the penultimate section of Summit and Decline, in which Bataille makes the pretense of answering the potential questions that could have arisen from this inquiry. And of course, the questioning leads nowhere, but Bataille's so-called answers nevertheless help us perceive perhaps what the stakes of this great gambit are for Bataille. He writes, quote, "Is there a moral goal that I can reach beyond being? To which I have already answered, in any event, that I wouldn't be able to go searching for it, or talking about it. I live, and in me is life, language. Now, the language that is in me can't give up having a moral goal. All it can do is suggest that if I follow the slopes of decline, I'll never arrive at that goal. And this said, I continue to live. I'll add, speaking in my name, I can't find a good to substitute for the goal eluding me. I no longer know of any reason outside me to sacrifice either myself or the small quantity of strength I have. I live, vulnerable to laughter on one hand, leaving me cheerful, and sexual stimulation on the other, leaving me anxious, Mystical states are available to me if that is what I want. Maintaining my distance from beliefs, deprived of hopes, nothing compels me to enter these states. I feel removed from the notion of making efforts to attain them. Making my inner experience a project, doesn't that result in a remoteness on my part from the summit that might have been? With those who have motives and reasons, I don't feel as if I'm missing anything, so I'm not envious, just the opposite, since I encourage them to share my fate. My mistrust of motivations and fragility are, I think, propitious. The greatest difficulty in my situation is my luck. I'm intoxicated by it. But exploding inside me, despite everything, is a question. What can a clear-sighted person do in this world, having incontrovertible demands within? End quote. And it's precisely a question that we can't really have an answer to from this text. And, it may seem like a strange analogy given Bataille's fascination with transgression and lust and violence and evil. Once again, I'm reminded of the Zen tradition. He's disregarded the Buddhists in the course of these writings as another form of ascetic moralism that evidences decline. But Zen is somewhat different because of the violence involved in many of these stories. Killing cats and chopping people's fingers off and slapping and screaming at people. But second, because of the fact that the stories are full of people with a fiery yearning for this mystical summit, the realization of Buddha nature, which is effectively no self, and thus, as Bataille describes it, the dissolution of everything that gives phenomena their stable appearance, everything that supports us. And this can't be attained by work or diligence, as we've gone over. It happens spontaneously, and so we might say it happens by chance or by luck. It's just a matter of luck whether you get enlightened and reach the summit or not. Bataille seeks to articulate a similarly radical conception of spirituality, which perhaps that's the wrong word, but for lack of a better one, a spirituality which affirms chance and eschews action, and thus provides the possibility for an existence which is not fragmented. But the yearning, of course, remains, however much we may acknowledge that it is a yearning for something that can't be attained by effort. It's like Kafka's castle, as Bataille makes the comparison earlier in the text. It is simply whatever is inaccessible. And that's why his inner demands are incontrovertible. Reason can't contend with them. No case can be made for or against them. Whatever is inaccessible, whatever stands beyond, can't bear comparison to anything within our grasp. We can't find a substitute among the world of ordinary effort and expenditure. And yet it is what stands beyond that ever and anon draws us forward. Like Goethe, we might be tempted to say that this perception of the summit lures us to perfection. But this perfection would just be another subordination to a moral justification. What I'm trying to describe instead is that living is desiring, and desiring is always aimed beyond the self. And whenever a beyond is conquered, a new frontier of desire opens up. The goodwill towards life that Bataille describes, the ultimate limit of life's attraction to life, desire, desiring, desire, is not aimed at any idea of perfection. It simply is what it is. It simply is desire desiring itself, justifying itself. And even to speak of justification here is insufficient. It's foolish. It would be better to simply leave it as an attraction, as a yearning. You might say perhaps an instinctive affirmation. But Bataille says that he believes his way of playing the dice game of fate is propitious. Even the form of the book attests to this, a book that defies normal literary structures, sutures them together in a chaotic fashion, a book that doesn't seem capable of accomplishing anything, written by a man who is content to fail, without regard for the outcome, without regard for returns on his expenditure of energy. Bataille is willing to leave everything up to chance. And in a way, for my Nietzschean disposition myself, I think that's beautiful. Join me next time when we'll follow Bataille through his experiences, both inner and outer, during the final year of World War II. Until then, thank you for joining me. May the odds be ever in your favor. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.